dreamers wake the nation. Come, the new Jerusalem. Silver cities rise, the morning lights, the streets that meet them, and sirens call them on with a song. It's asking for the taking, trembling, shaking. Oh, my heart is aching. We're coming to the edge, running on the water, coming through the fog, your sons and daughters. We, the great and small, stand on a star and blaze a trail of desire through the darkening dawn. It's asking for the taking. Come run with it now. The sky is the color of blue you've never even seen in the eyes of your lover. My heart is aching. We're coming to the edge, running on the water, coming through the fog, your sons and daughters.
On a day like this, I'm impressed that you're here. This is the kind of weather that we tell visitors to Seattle, it's never like this. But I'm delighted to be here with you, and especially on a day we're honoring the energies of the feminine. Runs through each and every one of us, and we express it in different ways. In Jewish tradition, the indwelling presence is feminine. It's called Shekhinah. Shachan, Hebrew is a verbal language, so nouns are made of verbs standing still, as opposed to kind of Greek and English, which do the other way. Nominal languages and verbs are nouns moving. But the root of Shekhinah is Shachan, which means to dwell, the indweller. Each and every one of us coming to every moment seeking to awaken to the reality of that which indwells. And so often covering that over with the dramas, the excitements, the fears, the quandaries, the polarizations of our individual lives, of our lives in our country, of our lives in our world. Rachamim Rachamim in Hebrew is compassion. And the root is rechem, which means womb. In the language, compassion is a womb love. It's something that the masculine energy has a lot of difficulty with, because the masculine energy kind of wants to control things, wants to get things clear, get things straight, have things happen, know what's happening. And womb love is that love that holds and nurtures that which is growing, just allowing it to totally take care. And then when that is ready to be born, whether it's a being or an idea or a plan or a way, to support it to the extent it needs support, but then to know it's gonna find its own way. Compassion trusts the other to find their own way and supports that in whatever way we can. And so on Mother's Day, we especially recognize those energies, that womb love, that compassion within each and every one of us. We would not be here without our mothers. Particularly the Abrahamic traditions are still trying to transcend a history of patriarchy. One of the ways our traditions stray is when we do not support the equality of men and women. And I'm convinced that one of the reasons we have so much difficulty doing that as men is the power of women. You can always tell who someone's mother is, but you cannot always tell who someone's father is. So in tribal times, rules had to be set because they didn't yet know about DNA testing. Rules had to be set to control access to the women. And I'm convinced to a great extent we men are still afraid of the natural power of women. And what would this world be like if our country and our armies were run by women? I want to talk about Revelation, although I did notice that when the screen was up, it's not there anymore, but it said your theme now was forgiveness. And it reminded me, like many years ago, I would be speaking here at most once a year, sometimes less often. And after one of the times I spoke, someone in the congregation approached me and said, "Do you know that this is the third time you've spoken about forgiveness?" Now, it interested me as I probably came 3 times, gave the same talk, and there was only one person there who knew that. And that person was not me. So if anybody's listening, God knows how many times I've given this talk. So I was thinking about Revelation because in the Jewish year, we're approaching the holiday on which it is celebrated, the meeting at Mount Sinai, the moment of the revelation of Torah, Torah meaning teaching, but specifically the 10 principles and the what unfolded as the text of the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. We left Egypt 6 weeks ago, and the biblical text says, after Passover, you start counting 50 days. And on the 50th day, there's a holiday called Shavuot. The word Shavuot means weeks. So 7 weeks after Passover, we celebrate another holiday. And originally, both holidays, both Passover as well as Shavuot, were agricultural holidays. The development of Jewish tradition, things started by connection to the earth, and then they developed associated holidays were associated with historical events, and then as the tradition unfolded, associated with spiritual unfoldment. And you can kind of watch this evolution. Originally, Shavuot was the early summer harvest. But it became celebrated as the time of giving of Torah, the time of revelation. And the symbol in Jewish tradition for like the epitome of revelation, the paradigm of revelation, is that meeting at Sinai. It's a great image. I mean, all this is story. Story is the way we communicate across time and space. Story is the way we develop our own individual identities. We have our story, and we walk our story. And some stories are limited stories, and some stories are big stories. In other words, some stories are personal stories, and some stories include all of us. And of course, the meeting at Sinai was meant to include all of us. We leave a place of enslavement, and what's enslavement? I mean, yes, enslavement is physical and represented as such, but the deeper enslavement that we keep slipping into is the enslavement to our individual identity. It's the limitation of our idea of who we are, our idea of what we are, an idea of what we're doing here. Enslavement is a total collapse into the temporality of that ego. And liberation is the process of awakening out of the trance. That trance in which we identify our me as I. And think that's all we are. A land of separateness, a land of fragmentation, a land of many unclarities, a land of many polarizations. So the idea was that on a spiritual level, between leaving that place of entrancement with the ego, stuckness, there's a process, and we get to a place called Sinai where we can hear something more profound. And here's the difference between revelation spiritual revelation and all other kinds of revelation. We get revelations every day. You open up a newspaper or you look at the news on your phone, and boy, oh boy, there's revelations. There's look what was going on, and we didn't know it was going on. Look what's about to go on, and we didn't know it was about to go on. Look what just got revealed that we could be upset about now. It's just a wonderful thing. And then we forget what we were upset about yesterday because what we get upset about today is too big. And it just drives us further and further into the trance of separation. That kind of revelation tells us what we did not know. Spiritual revelation tells us what we always knew, but we had forgotten. Spiritual revelation is a process of remembering. It is a process of awakening. You probably remember a book that a guy named Richard Adams wrote called Watership Down. Richard Adams also wrote a little book called The Unbroken Web, a little book of fables and stories, the preface or the introduction to which he described an image of a web of consciousness that encloses this planet, an evolving web of consciousness that as it evolves becomes available to those of us who are open. And as that web unfolds, that greater wisdom is heard, received. It's one of the reasons why when the Golden Rule was shared, it awakened within 7 different cultures around the same time. And we argue, well, which one had it first and the others copied it. But it's not like that. And I don't know how it is in your life, but there have been times in mine where I thought this was the only person who was doing a particular kind of work, and then all of a sudden you discover, wait, there's a whole bunch of other people across the planet who've been doing the same thing. Happened with Kubler-Ross, who was a revolutionary, but she wasn't the only revolutionary. At the same time, talking to people about their experiences of dying, working with children and art. I mean, it's kind of mind-boggling to look at that and go, something bigger is going on here. And that something bigger, I'm very fond of that image from Richard Adams. Like we are heirs to evolving web of consciousness. Which is to say that revelation is different from every other kind of communication because every other kind of communication happens at a particular time in a particular place. And we can repeat it, we can write it, we can share it. But it happened at a particular time in a particular place, except for revelation, because revelation is always. Whatever is unfolding is happening always and happening right now. It's almost like revelation, there's a channel of revelation that we need to learn to tune into, where that's always there. And if we truly tune into it, we will not only be able to understand greater remembering about the nature of our own being, but we will be able to understand the expressions of that has been translated through history in different traditions, in different languages, in different cultures. Because the revelation itself doesn't come in words. It's bigger than words. So whenever someone awakens to that, that gets translated through whatever language, whatever culture, whatever symbol systems, whatever historical time and place that individual is going to express into. But once one tastes that universal wisdom, one can recognize it in different places. And this is a lot of what is spoken about here when you talk about how do you find the wisdom in different traditions. Like, how does your tradition talk about it? How does your tradition celebrate oneness? How does your tradition celebrate love? How does your tradition celebrate compassion? Because maybe your words can help me remember. Maybe my words can help you remember. So at the scene at Sinai, it was a rather tumultuous scene for those of you who might remember the text this is the 19th and 20th chapter of the book of Exodus, where we meet the mountain and the mountain is quaking and there's smoke and there's thunder and there's lightning. And the only sound, it says, that all of us heard was the sound of the ram's horn, the sound of the shofar. But Moses was able to translate that sound into words with which to communicate to people. The question was, what did the people actually hear? Jewish tradition, this is asked through the centuries. Because according to the text, it's unclear. Did only Moses hear, is already translated? The very first word, what's delivered then is called it's called the Ten Commandments, right? However, in the biblical text, they're never called commandments. They're called devarim, which means either words or principles. They're called the 10 principles. They have to do with how reality functions on this planet, and perhaps more. And the transmission, as it's translated, starts with the word Anochi. Anochi Adonai Elohecha, usually translated, I am the eternal your God, which is an unfortunate translation because the text literally translates as I am is the eternal your God. It's a huge difference. Remember when Moses encountered the burning bush and he said to God, what's your name? Only time anybody asked God that. And God said, Ehyeh asher ehyeh, I am as I am. I am. Well, obviously, if the universe is expressing a oneness, there is no other pronoun that is unitive. Every other pronoun except first person singular demands a contrast. Every he demands a she, every you demands a me, every we demands a they. Except for first person singular, I. That's the only one that can be one. If this whole thing is one, then its name is I. And it gets very confusing because my name is I too. But it is so easy to forget that the I is so much bigger than this I or that I. Each of us an individual expression of that which is universal. Each of us in our individual expressions finding it so easy to forget that we're vehicles for something that's greater. And not only are we, but each and every one of us. And that's where, incidentally, the golden rule stops being a rule and becomes the golden reality, where we realize we want to support others as they would like to be supported, because we know that what's awakening behind their eyes is the same life that's awakening behind our eyes. And to the extent we support each other, we support ourselves and all others. And to the extent we bring harm and pain on another, we bring harm and pain on ourselves. And that's a realization, and when it's a realization, it's no longer a rule, and that's when the world changes. So I just wanted to share. Anochi Adonai Elohecha, I am is the Eternal One, your God, who brought you out from the land of slavery, land of stuckness. That's not a commandment. That's a fact. Like what brings us out of every place of limitation is an awakening to the nature of who we are. The realization of our identity frees us. That freeing can never happen as a gift from someone or some power outside ourselves. It's not something I can give you, it's something you already have. It's an awakening. And then it says, the second principle is, you shall not have any other gods. But it really can be translated just as easily, you can't. You cannot have any other gods. Which is to say, there's only one. Wait, no, we've got one and you've got one and your one is different than my one. I mean, if you really think about it, it's nuts. We've got the right one. You've got the wrong one. I've got the book that the right one wrote. No, you've got the translation that flowed through teachers and wisdom from your tradition, and I have the book that flowed through the teachers and the wisdom of my tradition, and let's find out what's the deeper wisdom that's hiding within all our texts. And as well, let's identify those places in our holy scriptures where our individual meanness intruded into a universal message. Because there's no other way with that, it's gonna be there. And until we're able to recognize it in our own traditions, well, there's no way of making peace. When somebody said, until there's peace among religions, there can be no peace in the world, it's something with which I wholeheartedly agree. And we find it difficult even to find peace within a religion, much less between and among them. There's only one. And if you have more than that, then you're back to a notion that this universe is made up of factions, of separation, that are in contention with each other, an unending battle. And that's ego land. That's polarization land. That's not oneness land. And then the third principle, which is my favorite principle, Lo tisa et shem Adonai Elohecha lashav. Enough said, thank you. Usually translated, you shall not take the name of the Eternal One your God in vain, right? Now, I don't know how it was or whether you received kind of standard religious training when you were growing up, but what I received when I was growing up was, don't swear. Now that's really interesting. So you get a principle, and I was taught it said commandment. You get a commandment that there's only one. You get a commandment that no idolatry, because that splits apart everything. Then you get a commandment, don't swear, and that comes before don't kill, and don't steal, and don't commit adultery. And you go, what? Who did we think those people were? Terrible, terrible. The problem, so many of the problems are in translation. Boy, personal as well as cultural. Lo tisa et shem Adonai Elohecha l'shav actually means you cannot use the name of the Eternal One, your God, and have nothing happen. And what's the name? Well, it's the name that we use more than any other name. We're speaking God's name all the time. Almost every thought, almost every sentence we share starts, I am. I am this, I am that, I am not that. I am not this. You can't use that and have nothing happen. Sounds like Center for Spiritual Living. How did they know that? But it's very instructive because we don't know how many of them knew that. Each and every one of us knows how it is to be living in a life where we know it and then we forget it, and then we know it and then we forget it. And when we forget it, we forgot that we even forgot it. And the question always is, how do I know if I'm awake now? I assume that I'm pretty much always not awake to something. You know, it's like, do you know your blind spots? Do you have any recollection of moments in your life when you awakened to what had been a blind spot? And when you go, oh, and you realize something's been there all the time, but you didn't see it or didn't know it or didn't recognize it? And what's waiting in this moment? What is right here that we're going to go, oh, wow. But those are the precious moments in life which leads us to suspect, walking around in our individual egos, that we don't know the whole story right now. It's bigger than I can know right now. I think I'm right, but we need to leave some open spaces. The ego actually hates surprises. But every time a blind spot opens, it's a surprise. So it's like reminding ourselves that at any moment we might wake up. And what is waiting for us to meet in that awakening? Well, the truth is we have some idea of that from the teachings of the ancients and from those moments when we have awakened. We know that the more we awaken, the more conscious we are, the more connected we are to that realm of spiritual revelation, the more we're able to remember the fuller dimensions of our being and the fuller dimensions of all being, the more we're in love. Oh, and I'm not talking about just a romantic love, which is great. Romantic love is very personal, and it's also conditional. But when we're in love, we're operating in a field of love. And we're in love with each other, but it's not personal in that way. It's bigger. We're just walking in love. When we experience ourselves separate, when we experience everything fragmented, when we are feeling unclear about our own purpose, about the meaning of our lives, we can pretty much count on the fact that we are unconscious. We are not connected. We have collapsed into the individualized structure of our identity. And the biggest thing we need then is the same thing we need all the time, and that is our natural tendency is to judge ourselves as bad and to try to fix ourselves. And the way is always, the means and the end are always the same. The way is love. Can we love ourselves enough when we find ourselves unconscious? Can we love each other enough when we witness each other caught in separation? Connection, belonging. When I feel I am connected, when I feel I belong. Symptoms of spiritual consciousness. When I look at others and strive to help and strive to support, when I realize I care, so traditions identify a specific moment of revelation. In Jewish tradition, it's Sinai. In Christian tradition, it's Jesus. In Islam, it's the delivery of the Quran from God to Gabriel to Muhammad. Every tradition has its understood transmission. But I'll tell you when revelation is happening. Because revelation is always happening now. There's no other time for it to happen. And each of us, when we awaken to that revelation, is going to translate it as best we can through the words we speak, the actions we express, and the lives we lead. And then to stay open, because there's still stuff we're not seeing. There's still stuff waiting to be met. The path of revelation is a path itself of liberation. And it's never ending, because the process is evolving. Perhaps you can sense it in the silent moments right here. Perhaps you can recognize it in an awareness of connection right now in this community. Perhaps you can realize it as the one looking at me through your eyes and the one looking at you through my eyes is the same one. It's time to celebrate that one. It's time to express that one. Happy Mother's Day.